Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
On December 17, 2010, a 26-year-old Tunisian street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi walked into a local government office in Sidi Bouzid, stood in front of the building, doused himself in paint thinner, and set himself on fire. His vegetable cart had been confiscated. A municipal inspector had slapped him in the face. He had tried to file a complaint. No one would see him. He had no recourse, no power, no voice. So he made himself into a message that cannot be ignored. Bouazizi died on January 4th, 2011. By then, his act of desperate protest had ignited something no one predicted. Protests erupted across Tunisia. Within weeks, President Zain El Abidine Ben Ali, who had ruled for 23 years, fled the country. The Tunisian revolution had succeeded. The fire spread. Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain. Across the Arab world, populations that had lived under authoritarian rule for decades took to the streets, demanding dignity, freedom, and self-determination. Western observers were intoxicated. The comparisons to 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall were irresistible. Commentators spoke of a democratic wave sweeping across the Middle East. The phrase, Arab Spring, entered the lexicon. Springtime, renewal, hope. A decade and a half later, the results are in. Tunisia, the one success story, reverted to authoritarianism. President Kais Saied dissolved parliament in 2021 and rewrote the constitution to concentrate power in his own hands. Egypt's brief democratic experiment ended in a military coup that installed Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, whose regime is more repressive than Mubarak's. Libya is a failed state, fragmented among rival governments, overrun by militias, with open-air slave markets operating in a country the United States helped liberate. Syria endured nearly 14 years of civil war that killed over 500,000 people, displaced 13 million, and ended not with the democratic revolution the West promised to support, but with the country's seizure by a coalition led by a former al-Qaeda affiliate. Yemen became the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. Nearly 20 million people in need of assistance after a decade of war, fueled by American weapons. American intervention did not cause all of this, but it made much of it immeasurably worse. And that is what today's episode examines. What makes the Arab Spring interventions particularly damning is that they occurred under a president who had been elected because of his opposition to the Iraq War. Barack Obama understood, or should have understood, the lessons of Iraq. Yet within 2 years of taking office, his administration was pursuing regime change in Libya and a covert war in Syria. If even a president skeptical of intervention cannot resist the institutional pressures, the humanitarian rhetoric, and the adversary apparatus that push toward war, the problem is not individual judgment. It is systemic. Today, we trace that system through 3 countries, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, and ask whether the pattern established in Iraq can ever be broken, or whether the machinery of intervention operates regardless of who sits in the Oval Office, regardless of what lessons the previous catastrophe should have taught, and regardless of the human cost that accumulates with each repetition. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 16 of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, the Arab Springs Winter, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and the pattern continues. This episode corresponds to Article 16 of our written series, and as always, the podcast episode expands on themes from the article with additional context and primary sources. Today's episode connects directly to the post-9/11 wars we examined in episode 15. The same machinery, the same assumptions, the same rhetoric, applied to new countries with identical results. Let us begin. When protests against Muammar Gaddafi erupted in February 2011, the Libyan leader threatened to crush the rebellion. Within the Obama administration, a faction led by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, UN Ambassador Susan Rice, and National Security Council aide Samantha Power pushed for military intervention. They invoked the doctrine of responsibility to protect, R2P, the principle developed after the Rwandan genocide that the international community has an obligation to intervene when a state fails to protect its population from mass atrocities. The argument was morally compelling in the abstract, but in practice, it concealed a bait and switch that would discredit the doctrine itself. Before we examine what happened, let me know what had happened before, because the context matters enormously. After the Iraq invasion in 2003, Gaddafi made a strategic decision. He voluntarily surrendered Libya's nuclear weapons program. He opened his country to international inspectors. He shared intelligence files with Western agencies. He cooperated extensively on counterterrorism. He was, in short, doing exactly what American non-proliferation policy claimed to want, giving up weapons of mass destruction in exchange for normalized relations. The lesson his overthrow sent to every other dictator on earth was devastating. Cooperate with the United States, surrender your weapons, and you will be overthrown anyway. North Korea's Kim Jong-un explicitly cited Gaddafi's fate as the reason he would never surrender his nuclear program. In 2018, ahead of nuclear negotiations, a North Korean official stated plainly that Libya's denuclearization was not a model, but a warning. The Libya intervention did not merely fail on its own terms, it made every future non-proliferation effort harder. It taught the world that American promises are not binding and that the only reliable defense against American regime change is a nuclear arsenal. United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973 in March 2011, authorizing a no-fly zone and all necessary measures to protect civilians. Russia and China abstained rather than veto. The resolution authorized civilian protection. NATO, led by the United States, France, and Britain, used it to pursue regime change. This was the bait and switch. The authorization was for protection. The execution was for overthrow. Russia and China, feeling deceived, would never again allow a similar resolution to pass. When Syria's civil war descended into mass atrocity, Russia and China vetoed every attempt at Security Council action, citing Libya as the precedent. The abuse of R2P in Libya ensured that R2P could not be invoked in Syria. The doctrine designed to prevent atrocities was corrupted in one country and rendered unavailable for the next. NATO air power systematically destroyed Gaddafi's military capabilities over 7 months. And special operations assistance on the ground, despite the official claim that there were no boots on the ground, advanced on Tripoli. On October 20th, 2011, Gaddafi was captured by rebel fighters. He was beaten, sodomized with a bayonet, and shot. The video was broadcast worldwide. Secretary of State Clinton, informed of his death on camera by a reporter who showed her a mobile phone, laughed and said, "We came, we saw, he died."
No, it's so, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed reports.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
The reference was to Julius Caesar. The candor was revealing. A man had been tortured to death. A country was about to collapse into chaos. And the Secretary of State made a joke. What followed was precisely what Iraq should have taught Washington to expect, and precisely what the critics of intervention had predicted. Libya collapsed into a failed state. The central government disintegrated. Rival militias, many of them armed with weapons looted from Gaddafi's vast arsenals, carved the country into competing fiefdoms. Two rival governments claimed legitimacy, one in Tripoli and one in the east. Islamist militias, including ISIS affiliates, established footholds. Human trafficking networks turned Libya into the primary transit point for migrants attempting to reach Europe, with migrants held in detention centers under conditions that the United Nations described as crimes against humanity. CNN documented open-air slave markets in November 2017. Human beings auctioned in a country the United States had liberated. Gaddafi's weapon arsenals, among the largest in Africa, accumulated over 4 decades of rule, were looted and dispersed across North Africa and the Sahel. The arsenals included shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and millions of rounds of ammunition. Weapons flowed to militant groups in Mali, Nigeria, and the Central African Republic and beyond. Tuareg fighters who had served in Gaddafi's military returned to Mali armed with Libyan weapons and launched a rebellion that destabilized the entire Sahel region. The rebellion created the conditions for a jihadist insurgency, a French military intervention, and a series of military coups that have toppled elected governments across West Africa. The cascading consequences of the Libya intervention are still unfolding, a decade and a half later, across an entire continent. On September 11th, 2012, 11 years to the day after the original September 11th attacks, armed militants attacked the American diplomatic compound and a nearby CIA annex in Benghazi, killing Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 other Americans. The attack became a partisan controversy in the United States. Republicans blamed the Obama administration's security failures and post-attack messaging. Democrats defended the response. What neither party seriously addressed was the deeper question: why the United States had intervened in Libya at all. What had it accomplished? And whether the entire enterprise had been a catastrophic error. President Obama, asked in 2016 about his worst mistake, identified Libya, specifically failing to plan for the day after. But the problem was not failing to plan for the aftermath. The problem was the intervention itself. It was the Iraq playbook executed with air power instead of ground troops and with identical results. Clinton had called Libya smart power at its best. Smart power with slave markets. Protests against Bashar al-Assad began in March 2011. Inspired by the revolutions elsewhere in the Arab world, Assad responded with the brutality his family had practiced for 4 decades. His father, Hafez, had leveled the city of Hama in 1982, killing an estimated 10,000 to 40,000 people to crush an Islamist uprising. Bashar followed the playbook. Security forces fired on demonstrators. Mass arrests followed. Torture was systematic. The protests escalated into armed resistance, and by late 2011, Syria was descending into civil war. In August 2011, President Obama declared that Assad must step aside. It was a statement that committed American credibility to an outcome the administration was unwilling to pursue with the resources or the strategy necessary to achieve it. Obama had drawn a line without intending to cross it. And that gap between rhetoric and action would define the Syrian catastrophe. The CIA launched Operation Timber Sycamore, a covert program to arm and train Syrian rebel groups that would ultimately cost over $1 billion. The program was one of the largest covert operations since the Afghan Mujahideen program in the 1980s. A comparison that should have given its architects pause, given how the Afghan operation ended. Weapons flowed through Jordan and Turkey. Saudi Arabia matched American funding dollar for dollar, just as it had during the Afghan operation. And as in Afghanistan, the distribution of weapons was influenced by allies. Saudi Arabia and Turkey in particular, whose priorities diverged sharply from the American objectives. The connection between Libya and Syria was not merely thematic. Investigative reporting revealed that the CIA facilitated the transfer of weapons from Libya's looted arsenals to Syrian rebel groups, a pipeline that ran through the Benghazi facility where Ambassador Stevens was killed. The intervention in one country fed directly into the intervention in the next. The weapons America helped scatter across Libya ended in the hands of fighters in Syria, some of them jihadists that American policy ostensibly opposed. The Pentagon ran a separate program, spending $500 million to train moderate fighters. In September 2015, General Lloyd Austin, commander of U.S. Central Command, the four-star general responsible for the entire Middle East theater, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee and was asked how many American-trained fighters were actually operating on the ground in Syria. His answer? It is a small number. The ones that are in the fight we're talking 4 or 5. 4 or 5? $500 million, 4 or 5 fighters. That is approximately $100 million per fighter. The admission was so absurd that senators visibly struggled to maintain composure. But behind the absurdity lay a human catastrophe of staggering proportions. The central problem of the Syrian intervention was the fiction of the moderate rebel. The opposition to Assad was never unified. It included secular nationalists who genuinely wanted democracy. It included Islamists of varying degrees of radicalism. It included Kurdish separatists in the northeast, and it included jihadists affiliated with al-Qaeda, specifically the al-Nusra Front, which was al-Qaeda's official Syrian affiliate, and eventually ISIS. The United States attempted to identify and support moderate factions, but the battlefield reality defied such tidy categorizations. Weapons and support provided to vetted groups routinely ended up in the hands of extremists. Fighters moved between factions depending on which offered the best weapons, pay, and prospects. In some cases, entire units defected from American-backed groups to jihadist organizations, carrying their American-supplied weapons with them. Al-Nusra Front was among the strongest rebel factions and frequently cooperated with groups that had passed American vetting, fighting alongside them, sharing logistics with them, and in some cases, absorbing them entirely. The absurdity reached its peak when American-backed rebels and Pentagon-backed rebels fought each other in northern Syria. The CIA's Timber Sycamore program and the Pentagon's own training program operated with different objectives, different vetted groups, and occasionally conflicting operational goals. The United States was not merely failing to coordinate with its allies, it was failing to coordinate with itself. Meanwhile, America's ostensible allies pursued their own interests with relentless determination and no regard for American objectives. Saudi Arabia and Qatar poured money into rebel factions that aligned with their sectarian preferences, Sunni Islamist groups, including ones that American intelligence classified as extremist. The Saudi and Qatari funding dwarfed American support and flowed to factions that the United States was not supporting and in some cases was actively opposing. Patrick Cockburn documented this extensively in The Rise of the Islamic State. Turkey, a NATO ally, allowed jihadist fighters to transit its territory into Syria. Turkish border posts that should have been sealing the flow of foreign fighters into the conflict were, for years, effectively opened doors. Turkey's priority was not defeating Assad or ISIS. Turkey's priority was preventing Kurdish autonomy in northern Syria, because an autonomous Kurdish region in Syria would embolden the Kurdish population inside Turkey itself. The Kurdish forces, the YPG, operating as the core of the Syrian Democratic Forces, proved to be America's most effective partner against ISIS. Turkey attacked them anyway. A NATO ally was bombing the fighters that the United States relied upon to defeat the Islamic State. In August 2012, Obama declared that the use of chemical weapons by Assad would constitute a red line. In August 2013, a chemical weapons attack in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta killed hundreds of civilians. Obama prepared military strikes, then pulled back, opting instead for a Russian brokered deal to remove Assad's chemical weapons stockpiles. In Washington, the episode was treated as a failure of credibility. Hawks argued that Obama's failure to enforce his red line emboldened Assad, emboldened Putin, and emboldened adversaries worldwide. The non-interventionist reading was different. Obama had stumbled into an ultimatum he did not want to enforce, recognized that missile strikes would not resolve the conflict, and found a diplomatic solution that actually achieved the ostensible objective: removing the chemical weapons. But in the distorted incentive structure of American foreign policy discourse, the diplomatic solution was treated as weakness, and the military option as strength. In September 2015, Russia intervened militarily. Russian air power, combined with Iranian-backed ground forces, including Hezbollah, turned the tide of the war. The rebel groups the United States had armed were pushing back. Cities were besieged and bombarded with a brutality that the world watched in real time. Aleppo, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth, was devastated. The Russian intervention exposed the incoherence of the American strategy in terms that could not be denied. The United States was simultaneously fighting ISIS, which was fighting Assad, supporting rebels who were fighting Assad and sometimes cooperating with al-Qaeda, opposing Russia, which was fighting the rebels the United States supported, and relying on Kurdish forces who were under attack from Turkey, a NATO ally. The policy was not merely failing, it was self-contradicting at every level. In December 2024, after nearly 14 years of civil war, a rebel offensive led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an organization that evolved from al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate al-Nusra Front, swept across the country and toppled the Assad regime in a matter of days. The speed was stunning. Aleppo, Syria's second city and the site of some of the world's most devastating sieges, fell in 3 days. Hama fell next, then Homs. Southern rebel forces launched their own offensive. On December 8th, Assad fled to Moscow, granted asylum by the patron who had kept him in power for 9 years. His prime minister remained briefly before transferring authority to a provisional government led by the rebel coalition. The war, by the most comprehensive estimates, killed over 528,000 people, with some monitors placing the figure above 600,000, including tens of thousands who died in Assad's prison system from torture, medical neglect, and starvation. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights documented the names of over 546,000 dead. More than 64,000 died in Assad's detention facilities alone. More than 6 million Syrians fled the country as refugees, the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Another 7 million were internally displaced within Syria. Entire cities, Aleppo, Homs, Eastern Ghouta, Raqqa, Deir el-Zor, were reduced to rubble. The refugee crisis destabilized Europe, fueling the rise of far-right parties and anti-immigrant movements that have reshaped the continent's politics in ways that continue to unfold. The outcome was bitterly ironic on multiple levels. The United States spent years and billions of dollars attempting to remove Assad, and Assad was eventually removed not by American policy, not by the moderate rebels America funded, not by the diplomatic pressure America applied, but by a coalition led by a group with jihadist roots in a lightning offensive that no Western intelligence agency predicted, in circumstances the United States could neither control nor shape. The people who ultimately toppled Assad were the ideological descendants of the very forces that American counterterrorism policy had spent 2 decades fighting. The intervention achieved none of the stated objectives. It prolonged a war that might have ended years earlier with fewer dead if outside powers had not sustained the fighting by arming both sides. It empowered extremists by providing them with weapons, training grounds, and a narrative of holy war against a secular dictator backed by foreign powers. It generated a refugee crisis that continues to reshape European politics. It gave Russia its most significant military foothold in the Middle East in decades. And it left Syria in the hands of forces whose commitment to the democratic values that originally motivated the uprising remains, at best, profoundly uncertain. Scott Horton documents the Syrian intervention with meticulous precision in Enough Already, tracing how each escalation produced consequences worse than the problem it claimed to solve. The pattern is identical to Afghanistan. It is identical to Iraq. It is identical because the assumptions are identical, and the assumptions are wrong. Yemen. Yemen is the war America does not discuss. It is the intervention that receives no cable news coverage, no congressional hearings, no presidential debates. It is also the intervention in which American complicity is most direct, most documented, and most devastating. Yemen's civil war began in 2014 when Houthi rebels, a Shia movement from northern Yemen, aligned with, but not completely controlled by Iran, captured the capital city of Sana'a. It displaced the internationally recognized government, and in March 2014, Saudi Arabia launched a military intervention to restore that government with a coalition that included the United Arab Emirates and other Gulf states. The Obama administration supported the Saudi intervention, not with expression of concern, not with diplomatic encouragement, but with weapons, with intelligence, and with logistics, and with in-flight fueling for Saudi aircraft. Let me be specific about what that means, because the abstraction conceals the reality. American-manufactured bombs built by Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics in factories in American states employing American workers were loaded into Saudi aircraft, flown by Saudi pilots, trained in the United States, refueled in midair by American tanker aircraft, guided to their targets by American intelligence, and dropped on Yemeni civilians. On August 9th, 2018, a Saudi airstrike hit a school bus in Dahrain in northern Yemen. 40 children were killed. They were on a summer camp field trip. The bomb was identified. A 500-pound laser-guided Mk-82 manufactured by Lockheed Martin, sold to Saudi Arabia under a State Department-approved arms deal. The bus was not a military target. The children were not combatants. The boys were on a field trip. This is not an isolated incident. Saudi and coalition airstrikes hit hospitals, wedding parties, funeral gatherings, water treatment facilities, food production facilities, and schools. Mawatana for Human Rights, a Yemeni human rights organization, documented dozens of strikes on civilian targets using American and British supplied munitions. The strikes were not accidental in aggregate. The targeting was systematic. And the United States provided the weapons, the intelligence, and the mid-air refueling that made it possible. The Trump administration continued and expanded the support. The Biden administration, upon taking office, announced a pause on offensive support, but continued arms sales and logistical assistance. And the distinction between offensive and defensive support proved functionally meaningless. The humanitarian toll is almost beyond comprehension. Over 150,000 people were killed as a direct result of the military action between 2015 and 2019. But the direct killing was only part of the catastrophe and not the largest part. The Saudi-led coalition imposed a blockade of Houthi-controlled territory, where the majority of the Yemeni population lives. The blockade restricted the flow of food, fuel, and medicine. Yemen, which imports approximately 90% of its food, was strangled. Cholera epidemic swept the country. At its peak, the largest cholera outbreak in modern history, with over 1 million suspected cases. The disease spread because the bombing had destroyed the water treatment and sewage infrastructure, and the blockade had prevented the importation of medicines and water purification supplies. Children starved. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Save the Children estimated that the destruction of the healthcare facilities could cause 10,000 preventable child deaths annually. The images of emancipated Yemeni children too weak to cry, their ribs visible through translucent skin, should have provoked the same outrage the images from Biafra or Ethiopia once generated. Instead, they produced little more than periodic expressions of concern from officials who continued approving arms sales the following week. The United Nations designated Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis, a designation that is held for years. Through multiple administrations, through multiple congressional debates about arms sales, and through multiple expressions of deep concern that changed nothing. As of 2025, 10 years into the conflict, approximately 19.5 million Yemenis require humanitarian assistance. That is more than half the country's entire population. Over 83% live in poverty. More than 4.5 million are internally displaced, many of them displaced multiple times, driven from one temporary shelter to the next by successive waves of fighting. 17 million face severe food insecurity, with 5 million on the brink of famine. The Humanitarian Response Plan for 2025 requested $2.47 billion. As of March 2025, that was 5% funded. 5%. Expected reductions in American contributions, which had accounted for more than half the total humanitarian fighting, threatened to widen that gap further. These are not statistics. They're human beings, children, mothers, fathers, the elderly, slowly dying because a Saudi-led coalition armed by the United States decided that restoring a government was worth starving a population. In all honesty, it's a very similar outcome to the tragedy and the devastation in Gaza. Gaza is in the news. Gaza is heard about. Gaza is talked about in American circles. Yemen is not. Both suffer a very similar outcome. Blockades of food, medicine, supplies under the auspices of fighting a terror group by two different countries, Saudi Arabia and Israel. One gets the coverage, one does not. The strategic incoherence of American policy in Yemen was breathtaking. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, operated in Yemen and was considered among the most dangerous terrorist threats to the United States. AQAP had attempted to bomb American aircraft and had produced the most sophisticated explosive devices the counterterrorism community had encountered. The Houthis, whatever their other characteristics, were fighting AQAP. The Saudi intervention destabilized the country and strengthened AQAP because terrorist organizations thrive in chaos. The United States was simultaneously supporting the Saudi war against the Houthis and conducting its own counterterrorism operations against AQAP in the same country, working at cross purposes with itself. Again. Iran's influence grew as the war dragged on, precisely as it had in Iraq, precisely as non-interventionists had predicted. The Houthis, whose alignment with Iran had been limited before the war, deepened their relationship with Tehran as the Saudi-led campaign gave them every incentive to seek Iranian support. The intervention, designed to counter Iranian influence, expanded it. The pattern is identical to Iraq. It is identical because the logic is identical. The logic is wrong. The Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea that began in late 2023, launched in solidarity with the Palestinians during the Israeli war in Gaza, added yet another layer of consequence. The United States and the United Kingdom responded with over 300 airstrikes on Houthi-controlled territory. The Houthis, hardened by a decade of war against the most advanced weapons on earth, were not deterred. The attacks on shipping continued. The cycle spiraled. After 10 years, the Yemen war has produced no outcome that serves American interests. The Houthis control most of the country's population. AQAP persists. Iran's influence is greater than before the war began. Saudi Arabia, having spent billions and damaged its international reputation, has sought an exit. And nearly 20 million Yemeni civilians bear the consequences of decisions made in Riyadh, Washington, and Abu Dhabi. Decisions over which they had no voice and from which they received no benefit. Now let us step back from the specific cases and examine what they demonstrate collectively. The responsibility to protect doctrine was developed after Rwanda, when 800,000 Tutsis were murdered while the international community stood by. The moral impulse was genuine. Never again should the world watch mass slaughter and do nothing. R2P held that when a state fails to protect its people from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity, the international community has a responsibility to act. The doctrine was noble in conception. It was corrupted in application. In Libya, R2P was invoked to authorize civilian protection. It was used to pursue regime change. The bait and switch was transparent enough that Russia and China recognized it and resolved to never permit it again. When Syria's war descended into atrocity, when chemical weapons were used against civilians, when cities were besieged and barrel bombed, Russia and China vetoed every Security Council resolution, citing Libya as the reason. The corruption of R2P in Libya ensured that it could not function in Syria. The doctrine designed to prevent atrocities was weaponized in one country and thereby rendered unavailable in the next. The people who suffer the consequences of this corruption are not the diplomats and the think tank fellows who debated the doctrine's finer points. They are the Syrian civilians who might have been protected if the doctrine had not been discredited by its abuse. A consistent thread across all three interventions is the role of allied governments pursuing their own interests at America's expense. In Libya, France led the military campaign in part to reassert influence in North Africa. Saudi Arabia and the UAE pushed for intervention against Gaddafi, whom they viewed as an unpredictable rival. Each ally had objectives that overlapped with, but were not identical to American interests. In Syria, the divergence was more extreme. Saudi Arabia and Qatar funded rebel factions, including extremist ones, aligned with other sectarian objectives. Turkey used the chaos to suppress Kurdish autonomy while allowing jihadist transit. Israel, viewing Assad as an ally of Iran and Hezbollah, preferred rebel victory and conducted strikes on Syrian and Iranian targets. Each ally pursued its own logic. The United States bore the costs and the blame. In Yemen, the United States subordinated its counterterrorism objectives to the Saudi alliance. Arms sales, tens of billions of dollars in contracts with Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and General Dynamics, took precedence over both American strategic interests and the humanitarian principles Washington claimed to represent. The pattern echoes what we examined in episode 14. Allied governments shape American policy toward their interest, and the American people bear the consequences. The founders' warning about passionate attachment to foreign nations applies not to one alliance, but to the entire architecture that draws the United States into conflicts, serving others' objectives at American cost. The interventionist defense of the Arab Spring runs as follows. We cannot stand by while dictators massacre their people. The failure in Rwanda haunts us. The Arab Spring offered genuine opportunity for democratic transformation. Yes, interventions went wrong, but intentions were good, and inaction would have produced its own costs. The more sophisticated version argues that the problem was not intervention itself, but insufficient commitment. In Libya, we should have stayed for post-conflict stabilization, invested in institution building, disarmed the militias, built a functioning state. In Syria, Obama's half measures, arming rebels without committing to their victory, produced the worst of both worlds. Enough intervention to prolong the war, but not enough to end it. And in Yemen, we should have used our leverage to restrain Saudi Arabia rather than enable it. So let's engage this argument seriously. Because it is the argument that sustains the interventionist consensus across administrations and across parties. It is the argument that ensures the next intervention will always happen. The do it better argument has been made after every failed intervention since Vietnam. After Vietnam, the lesson was supposed to be clearer objectives and better execution. After Somalia, the lesson was supposed to be avoiding mission creep. After Iraq, the lesson was supposed to be post-conflict planning. After Libya, the lesson was supposed to be sustained engagement. After Syria, the lesson was supposed to be committing fully or not at all. Each failure generates a new theory about what went wrong that conveniently preserves the fundamental assumptions that intervention itself is sound. Only the execution fails. But at what point does the consistency of the failure indict the premise rather than the execution? The United States has intervened militarily in the Middle East and North Africa continuously for over 3 decades. It has tried large-scale invasion with extended occupation, Iraq. It has tried targeted strikes with no ground forces, Libya. It has tried covert operations and proxy wars, Syria. It has tried logistical supports for an allied military, Yemen. Every approach has been tried. Every approach has failed. The variable that remains consistent across every failure is intervention itself. The record is now long enough to constitute proof. Regime change creates power vacuums that extremists fill. Armed rebels prove uncontrollable. Allies pursue their own interests at American expense. Humanitarian intervention produces humanitarian catastrophe. And the foreign policy establishment learns nothing from the failure because failure carries no professional consequences for those who design and promote it. In fact, it's just the opposite. Incentives are there. Financial incentives from the military-industrial complex that create a revolving door with this foreign policy establishment. The Arab Spring interventions complete a trajectory that stretches across the entire series. Iran 1953, Guatemala 1954, Vietnam, Afghanistan in the 1980s, Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, Syria 2011, Yemen 2015. Each intervention created conditions for the next. Each consequence became the justification for further intervention. The overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran produced the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution shaped the Iraq-Iran War. The Iraq-Iran War and the Gulf War produced the sanctions that devastated Iraqi society. The Iraq invasion produced ISIS. ISIS expanded into the Syrian civil war. The Syrian refugee crisis destabilized Europe and fueled populist nationalism. The cycle continues because the institutions that produce it, the think tanks, the defense contractors, the revolving door, the intelligence agencies, the bipartisan consensus that intervention is America's role in the world remain intact and unaccountable. How many destroyed countries constitute proof that the policy does not work? How many dead? How many refugees? How many trillions of dollars? How many times must the same pattern repeat? Regime change, power vacuum, chaos, blowback, re-intervention, before the American people demand that it stop. Just stop. The question is not rhetorical. It demands an answer from every citizen who funds these operations and every official who authorizes them. The founders understood that a republic could not sustain an empire, that the machinery of war would consume the machinery of self-government. The power concentrated in the executive for the purpose of foreign intervention would not remain confined to foreign intervention. They were right about all of it. And the evidence from this series, from the Barbary Wars to the Arab Springs winter, is the proof. Today, we have traced the same pattern across 3 countries. Libya, regime change producing a failed state with slave markets. Syria, covert war prolonging a conflict that killed over 500,000 people. And Yemen, American weapons enabling the world's worst humanitarian crisis. In each case, the intervention was justified with humanitarian language. In each case, the outcome was humanitarian catastrophe. The Arab Spring began with a man setting himself on fire because his government would not let him sell vegetables in peace. It ended with failed states, millions of refugees, and the arsenals of the world's most advanced militaries deployed to produce outcomes indistinguishable from those they were designed to prevent. Next Sunday, Article 17 will examine the bear baited, how NATO expansion to Russian borders, the 2014 Ukraine crisis, and the ongoing war vindicated the warnings of George Kennan, John Mearsheimer, and every realist who predicted that treating a former superpower as a defeated enemy would produce exactly the confrontation it was supposed to prevent. The pattern of this series, intervention generating blowback, rhetoric divorced from reality, institutional momentum overriding strategic wisdom, takes on its most dangerous dimensions when the adversary possesses thousands of nuclear weapons. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 16 of Empire of Liberty, America's foreign entanglements from the founders to the forever wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.